Welcome to part 2 of building the mitre station. It was time to assemble the cabinet for the mitre saw to sit on. I attached the top of the cabinet by gluing and screwing through some cleats in from underneath. I wanted to make a small drawer for the top of the cabinet. It would be used to catch any sawdust and chippings that fall behind the saw that my dust collector misses, as the saw still makes a bit of mess even when my dust collector is connected. I used pine bed slats to set the spacing for the drawer, held in place with clamps, as I could later use these bed slats to make the sides and back of the drawer. I fitted a plywood shelf into the cabinet to support the drawer. It was a tight fit, so I knocked it into place with a hammer. Then I removed the pine bed slats and glued and screwed some cleats to support the shelf. Before making the drawer, I wanted to put together a simple plywood shelf unit which would sit on the worktop to add a bit of worktop storage space. So I cut the pieces to size on the table saw. Then for the sides of the shelf unit, I set the blade height of the table saw to around 5mm and made a series of cuts to create a dado joint 18mm wide for the shelf to sit in. Then I glued and screwed the shelf into place. I cut the top of the shelf unit a little bit wider so there'd be a slight overhang, and also cut some more dado joints to attach the top to the sides. I glued and clamped on the top and then used a jigsaw to cut out where the uprights in the workshop wall would be so I could position it at the back of the worktop. Then I started to work on the extended mitre fence which would be mounted to the worktop. I started with another piece of the L-shaped pine bed frame. I ripped each face to square them off and get rid of all the old finish. I cut it to length on the mitre saw. I found an old tape measure in my house which I wanted to attach to the fence to reference my mitre saw cuts against. I decided the best way to mount the tape onto the fence would be to cut another dado joint in the front face of the fence using the table saw to create a slot for the tape measure to sit in. So I made a series of cuts on the table saw, moving the table saw's fence by a few millimeters after each cut. And that works out really well. It fitted in there snugly without needing any glue or anything. I positioned the new extended fence parallel to the mitre saw fence using a framing square. Then I screwed it into the worktop. As the framing square wasn't long enough to check the entire length of the new extended fence, I just used a long straight piece of wood clamped to the mitre saw fence to check that it was parallel. Then I applied some boiled linseed oil to the new extended fence. Now for the difficult part. I had to slot the tape measure into the dado joint of the fence so that the cuts on the mitre saw would correlate with it. So I pushed a piece of scrap wood that I'd measured at 551mm right up against the blade. And clamped it in place. And then carefully slotted the tape measure into the dado joint so that the fence read 551mm at the end of that piece of wood. Then I cut some scrap pieces of wood using the measurements from the tape measure on the fence and checked the length of the scrap wood with another tape measure to see how accurate it was. I had a few attempts at this and kept getting within a millimetre of the right length, so I had to keep making subtle adjustments to the position of the tape measure in the fence by a tiny amount, and eventually I managed to get it accurate to the millimetre. I'm sure there was probably an easier way to do this, but the end result is good enough for me. I then made a simple stop block for the mitre fence by laminating together 2 pieces of plywood. I cut it square on the mitre saw, gave it a sand and finished it off with some more boiled linseed oil. The stop block will be really useful as I could just clamp it to the mitre fence for a great simple way to make repeated cuts at consistent lengths. At this point I encountered a bit of a problem. In the last video I did a test fit to make sure that the mitre saw could twist and tilt to 45 degrees where it would be positioned. Unfortunately, since I'd bolted the saw to the cabinet, it didn't quite lock onto the 45-degree position on the left hand side because of the corner of the worktop. After all that work getting the tape measure on the fence lined up and accurate, I decided to just chisel off the corner of the worktop rather than reposition everything again. It was a bit of a shame, but function is more important than form in my workshop. That solved the problem. So I sealed the corner of the worktop with some PVA glue and then painted it black so it didn't look as bad. Time to build the dust drawer next, so I chopped the bed slats to the right length for the drawer sides and then used the crosscut sled on my table saw to cut some shallow dado joint with the blade height at around 5mm again. I cut both the drawer sides at the same time, so each of the 2 sides was exactly the same. Then I slid the drawer sides into place and measured the distance between each dado joint so I could cut another bed slat to that length to create the back of the drawer. I glued and screwed the sides to the back. Then I did a test fit of the drawer and measured up what size the front of the drawer should be. I found an old scrap of pine skirting board which was about the right height for the drawer front, so I chopped it to length and glued and screwed it to the drawer sides while the drawer was positioned in the cabinet. Then I routed out a rabbet joint on the bottom of the drawer to accommodate a piece of 3mm plywood for the bottom of the drawer. The router doesn't reach into the corners, so I used a chisel to square them off. Luckily I had a scrap of plywood that was just about big enough to use for the bottom of the drawer, so I cut it down roughly to size with a saw. And then used a sander to sand it down until it slotted into place. Then I glued and nailed it. This drawer wasn't going to be very strong, but it doesn't really need to be as it'll only be holding some sawdust. I slotted the drawer into place and added some filler to cover the screw holes on the drawer front. And when it was dry, I sanded it flush and then gave it a couple of coats of black gloss paint. Later I added some partitions to the bottom shelf to create 3 different sections where I could stack my offcuts of wood, and you can see at the bottom of the mitre saw cabinet is a handy place to store my dust collector.